I was on that road. I was on that road because of something ordinary enough that I almost feel embarrassed telling the rest of it. My mother's older sister had been admitted to a small private clinic outside Alcara for a chest infection that wouldn't settle. It wasn't serious by then, but she was the kind of woman who became more frightened by being alone in a room than by the illness itself, so people had been taking turns sitting with her. That afternoon, it was supposed to be my cousin Nabil's shift, but his car broke down on the highway, and my mother asked if I could go instead. I finished work early, drove out before sunset, stayed longer than I meant to, then got delayed again because the doctor didn't come on time and my aunt wanted me there while he explained her medication. By the time I left, it was already close to 10:30. There were 2 ways back to the city. One was longer, but ran through the main highway and the outskirts, where there were stations, lights, and at least the occasional truck. The other cut through the old provincial road that passed low fields, an abandoned weighing station, and a stretch of marshy land before joining the ring road, closer to my neighborhood. I had taken that road many times in the daytime. At night, not often, but enough that it didn't feel reckless. I still had work in the morning, and I remember thinking that if I took the short road, I'd be home before midnight, maybe make tea, maybe sleep 6 hours if I was lucky. The weather looked manageable when I left the clinic parking lot. Cold, but steady. No rain. The fog began after about 15 minutes. It wasn't the kind that falls in strips or hangs in patches. It had settled low and even over everything, so that the road seemed to exist only as far as my headlights could push into it, and then nothing beyond that. The beams came back at me in a pale wash. The fields on both sides disappeared. Even the roadside poles seemed to materialize only at the last second, one after another, like they were being set down in front of me and then taken away behind me. I slowed without really deciding to. The speedometer dropped to 60, then 50. The wipers dragged once across a windshield that was hardly wet, just beaded with the kind of moisture that forms when the air itself feels soaked. I cracked my window a little because the glass kept hazing from the inside. Cold air came in with the smell of damp soil and something metallic, like water standing in rusted channels. I called my mother from the hands-free system to tell her I'd left the clinic. She asked whether my aunt had eaten, whether the doctor had said anything new, whether I had taken the bag of laundry she'd left by the bed. I told her yes to all of it, though I had forgotten the laundry and only realized that later. She told me to drive carefully because the fog had reached the city too. I said I would. We hung up. I put the phone back on the console and drove in silence for a while. That road is never lively, but that night it felt emptied out in a way I had never seen before. No oncoming headlights, no taillights ahead, no parked trucks, no motorcycles, nothing. Just the steady line of my own car moving through white haze. I remember the first time I saw him, because it felt so normal. He was walking on the right shoulder, facing the same direction I was driving, close enough to the edge line that at first I thought it was a signpost bending in the fog. Then he lifted one hand, not in a dramatic way, just a small motion, the kind someone makes when they're not sure whether it's worth asking a driver to stop. I eased off the accelerator and came closer. He looked like any man you might pass outside a bus station in a small town, mid-30s maybe, slim build, dark hair, a dark jacket zipped up to the neck. He was carrying a white plastic shopping bag in his left hand. I couldn't see his face clearly until I was almost beside him, but when I did, nothing about it struck me as unusual. Tired, maybe. Damp from the fog. He had a short beard, or maybe just a couple of days' stubble. His expression was neutral. I lowered the passenger window a little. He leaned down, keeping a respectful distance from the car, and said, "Does this road still lead to the bridge?" His voice was ordinary. That's important. If anything had sounded strange from the beginning, maybe I would have turned around right then, but there was nothing theatrical about him, nothing that would survive telling if I tried to make it sound frightening. He sounded like someone who had been walking a long time and wanted to make sure he hadn't gone the wrong way. "Yes," I said. "Keep straight. You're still far, though." "How far?" "Maybe 10 kilometers. Maybe less." He nodded once and looked down the road as if measuring it in his head. "There are no cars tonight." "No," I said. "Not many." He gave a small smile I barely saw through the mist. "Thank you." I drove on. That was all. For the next few minutes, I didn't think much about him beyond the ordinary guilt of leaving someone on a cold road. I considered stopping and offering him a ride, but I didn't know where exactly he was going. And in our part of the world, you learn a certain caution without anyone having to explain it to you. Not suspicion, exactly. Just caution. Not every road at night is a place for generosity. That sounds harsh, but it's the truth. I told myself the bridge wasn't too far. I told myself maybe he preferred walking. I told myself maybe he was waiting for someone. Then I rounded a very gentle bend, past a broken reflector post I knew was near the low canal, and saw him again. At least I believed it was him. Same height, same narrow frame, same dark jacket, same white plastic bag in the left hand. He was farther ahead on the shoulder, walking in the same direction. For a second, I had that stupid automatic thought people have when something doesn't make sense. Maybe he took a shortcut. Then the thought finished forming and fell apart on its own. There was no shortcut. On the right side of the road there was only a drainage ditch and low fields. On the left, if memory served, there was a wire fence and a slope down toward marshy ground. Even if there had been some farm path hidden in the fog, nothing could have brought him that far ahead of me in that short time. I checked the speedometer. I hadn't been crawling. I must have driven 3 or 4 kilometers since the first encounter. I looked at the man as I approached, trying to confirm that he was simply someone else. Another pedestrian. Another man in a dark jacket carrying a bag. When my headlights caught his face, I felt the first small shift inside me. It looked like the same face, but not exactly. The beard seemed lighter, or shorter. His hair looked flatter against his head, as if wetter. And there was something around his neck now, maybe a scarf or a dark collar turned up. Enough difference that I could have explained it away if I'd wanted to. Fog alters edges, light distorts. Faces on roads at night are half inventions anyway. He turned and looked directly at the car as I passed. He didn't raise his hand this time. He just watched. I kept driving. My hands had tightened on the wheel without me noticing. I loosened them and told myself very calmly that there were probably 2 men from the same village walking the same road. Brothers, maybe. Laborers dropped off by the same truck. Men dressed in the same kind of cheap jacket you can buy in any market. The plastic bag meant nothing. Half the men in the country carry things in white plastic bags. Still, I found myself checking the rearview mirror. Nothing behind me but fog and the reflection of my own taillights on the wet road. I turned the radio on low, then off again almost immediately because the sound felt out of place. I cracked the driver's window a little more. Cold air touched the side of my face. Somewhere far off, or maybe not far at all, I heard a dog bark once, and then stop. After another stretch of driving, the road straightened. I passed the old weighing station, a squat concrete shape that stood on the left side of the road with its barrier long broken and hanging crooked. In daylight, it looked abandoned in a dull, familiar way. That night, it was only a darker rectangle in the fog. Just beyond it, I saw him a third time. This time, he was standing still. He was beside the remains of a bus shelter, the kind with 3 concrete walls and no glass left in the frame. He stood just outside it with one hand in his pocket and the other hanging empty at his side. No bag. I remember saying something out loud, not to anyone, just an involuntary word under my breath. Maybe no. Maybe what? I don't know. I slowed because my body did that before my mind could decide. The car crept toward him. He stepped a little closer to the edge of the road and bent down toward the passenger side, not too near, the same as before. I did not lower the window all the way this time, only enough to hear. He said, "You said the bridge was 10 kilometers. He was speaking as if we had already been in the middle of a conversation. I stared at him. His face looked more distinct now, as if the fog had thinned just around him. The beard was there again, darker than before. The skin under his eyes looked gray with tiredness. There was a small nick or scar near one eyebrow that I was almost certain I hadn't seen earlier. But what unsettled me most was not any one feature. It was the arrangement of them. The face was close enough to the first face that it felt repeated, but not fixed, like someone sketching the same man from memory each time and changing the details without meaning to. "I don't think that was me," I said. He frowned slightly, as if I had answered a different question than the one he asked. "The bridge." "It's ahead," I said. "Keep straight." He looked past me into the car, not rudely, just searching. For what? I couldn't tell. Then he nodded. "Straight," he said quietly. I drove away harder than I meant to. The tires slipped a little on the damp shoulder before catching the road again. At that point, I should have turned around. That's what people say when they hear stories afterward, and normally they're right. But when you're inside something strange, you don't always recognize which moment deserves to be treated as final. There is a kind of embarrassment that keeps you moving. You don't want to be the man who panicked because he saw 3 pedestrians who looked alike in the fog. You don't want to build superstition out of coincidence while you're still close enough to ordinary explanations to use them. I told myself I was tired. I had been sitting in a clinic for hours under fluorescent lights. I hadn't eaten since the afternoon, except for a dry biscuit from the waiting room machine. My shoulders were tense. The road itself was disorienting. There was nothing around me to judge distance by. Maybe I had imagined the first bag. Maybe I had passed 2 men and spoken only once. Maybe I had been so focused on the empty road that I was stitching separate impressions together. I believed none of that completely, but I kept presenting it to myself like a lawyer with a weak case. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was my wife. The line was bad from the start. I heard only pieces of her voice, then a wash of static, then her again. "Are you still on the road?" "Yes." "Where are you now?" "Near the weighing station, I think. Maybe past it." "You sound strange." "The signal is bad." "Drive slowly." "I am." Then the line cut out. I tried calling back, but there was no service. The screen showed 1 bar, then none. I set the phone down and kept going. The fog thickened again in a way I would not have thought possible. It came across the road in a pale density that reduced everything to the width of the hood. I had to lean forward and squint, though it didn't help. My own headlights felt like a mistake. I considered pulling over and waiting it out, but the shoulder along that stretch was narrow, and the thought of sitting still out there with the engine idling felt worse than moving. Then I began to hear the footsteps. At first, they were so faint that I thought they were stones pinging up from the tires. But the rhythm was wrong, not random, not mechanical. A soft, regular crunch from somewhere outside the car, close enough to suggest someone walking on gravel. I lowered the radio volume, even though it was already off. There it was again. Crunch, Pause. Crunch. Pause. It seemed to move alongside the right side of the car for a few seconds, then fall back. I looked into the passenger mirror and saw only white haze and a smear of reflected light. The road shoulder was invisible. I sped up a little. The sound disappeared. A kilometer marker emerged on my left, then vanished behind me. I checked the clock on the dashboard. 11:18. I remember that because later I kept trying to work out how long certain things took, and that number stayed with me. Not far after that I saw him for the fourth time. This time he was standing almost in the middle of the lane. Not fully centered, but near enough that I had to brake immediately. The car slowed and rolled forward until he stepped back toward the shoulder. He held up one hand, palm down, a calming gesture. He was wearing the same dark jacket, but now it hung open. Underneath was a pale shirt, or maybe a sweater, damp and clinging at the collar. His trousers were dark with moisture from the knee down. He was no longer carrying a bag. What I noticed before anything else was that one of his shoes was missing. His right foot was in a dark sock already dirty with mud. I stopped with several meters between us. For a moment, we just looked at each other through the windshield and fog. Then he came closer to the passenger side. I opened the window no more than 2 fingers width. "Brother," he said in the same calm voice as before, "take me to the checkpoint." "There isn't a checkpoint ahead." There was. Not anymore. He glanced over his shoulder into the fog, as though someone might be following him. Then just a little. My mouth was dry. "I can call someone for you when I get signal." He leaned slightly nearer, not enough to threaten, just enough that I could see his face clearly. It was him, or it was the nearest version yet. The eyebrow mark was gone. The beard was shorter on one side than the other. His eyes looked tired but steady. No anger, no urgency, no desperation. If anything, he seemed patient with me in a way that made me more uncomfortable than fear would have. "I don't want to walk alone," he said. Something about the sentence made the skin along my arms tighten. Not the words themselves, the way he said them, like he was explaining a simple preference, like loneliness was the only issue on the road. "I'm sorry," I said. He nodded once, almost politely. "Of course," he said. I drove around him. For several seconds, I was sure I would feel a hand strike the trunk or hear him shout after me. Nothing happened. In the mirror, there was only the pale turbulence of fog swallowing the place where he had been. I kept both hands on the wheel and tried to breathe normally. I remember becoming very aware of small physical things. The seam pressing against my ring finger where I gripped the wheel. The way the heater was blowing air that had gone lukewarm. The ache at the base of my neck. It's strange what the mind does when it's approaching something it cannot place. It clings to measurements. I passed a billboard frame with no ad left on it, just torn paper hanging in strips. A minute later, I passed the same billboard frame again. I know what I'm saying. I have gone over this so many times that I stopped telling it to most people. I know how it sounds. Roads can repeat features. There are several billboard frames along that route. In fog, distance folds in on itself. But this one had a particular bend in the top left corner, and a pale strip of blue poster still stuck along the bottom bar. I saw it, registered it, and then saw it again, where it could not have been unless I had driven in a circle. There is no circle there. I slowed almost to a crawl. My heart was beating hard enough now that I could feel it in my throat. I took my phone and opened the map, hoping for the simple relief of a blue dot moving along a line. The screen took too long to load. When it did, the map tiles were blank gray, and the location marker trembled in place as if undecided. The wind picked up. I couldn't see anything moving, but I could hear it somewhere across the fields, a long, low rush through reeds or wire fencing. Then, very faintly underneath it, footsteps again. Not beside the car this time. Ahead. I should say something here about the old beliefs, because otherwise people assume I'm reaching for them only after the fact. I wasn't raised in a house where every creak in a wall became a spirit and every streak of bad luck became envy or sorcery. My father was practical to the point of irritation. If a light flickered, he checked the wiring. If a child woke crying, he checked for fever. But like most people, especially those raised by older women from villages, I grew up hearing certain warnings that sat in the mind whether you honored them or not. Don't answer when someone calls your name from empty land at night unless you see who it is. Don't follow a voice off the path in fog. If you see someone on the road more than once and the road is straight, recite quietly and keep moving. Some things don't appear to frighten you. They appear to be let in. I hadn't thought of any of that in years. Now it came back in fragments, not as belief exactly, but as memory. A language for unease. I began quietly reciting what most of us recite when we don't know what else to do. Not loudly, not with ceremony. Just under my breath with my eyes on the road. The next time I saw him, he was seated. There was a low concrete barrier on the left where the road widened slightly before the marsh crossing. He sat on it with his elbows on his knees, looking down, as if simply resting his feet. My headlights reached him in stages, first the shape of his back, then the side of his face, then his hands hanging between his knees. The white plastic bag was back. He lifted his head as I approached. I did not stop. I barely slowed. But even through the closed window, I saw his mouth move. I couldn't hear the words, yet I knew with the kind of certainty you don't want in moments like that he had spoken my name. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe I read the shape of his lips and supplied it myself. But the effect was immediate. My stomach dropped so quickly it felt like missing a stair in the dark. There was no reason he should know my name. I had not introduced myself. My wife had said my name earlier during the broken phone call, but the windows were up at the time and the car had been moving. I went back over every interaction in seconds, searching for some ordinary route by which he might have learned it. Nothing satisfied me. I drove on faster than was wise for the conditions. The car fishtailed once on the damp surface and corrected. I forced myself to slow again because I was more afraid of a real accident than I was of whatever else was happening. A few minutes later, I saw lights ahead and nearly cried with relief. They were dim and yellow through the fog, low to the ground, not moving. I thought it was a small roadside station, or one of those improvised tea kiosks drivers set up in shipping containers. I had no memory of one being there, but roads change. Someone installs a generator, hangs bulbs, sells cigarettes and sweet tea to truck drivers. It was possible. I drove toward the lights. As I got closer, I realized they were only two fixed lamps mounted on a rusting gatepost, leading into a disused agricultural service lane. The lane itself was chained off. Beyond the gate, there was no building that I could see, just taller fog and dark land. The lamps hummed faintly. I almost kept driving, but some part of me wanted the small comfort of stopping in a place marked by human intention, even if it was abandoned. I pulled onto the shoulder near the gate, left the engine running, and locked all the doors. For the first time since leaving the clinic, I was completely still. The silence around the idling engine was so total that it felt deliberate. No insects, no cars. Only the soft rattle of the fan, the ticking from the dashboard, and somewhere beyond the light, wind moving through the reeds. Then, I heard footsteps on gravel behind the car. Not running, not sneaking, just an even walk. They came up along the passenger side, close enough that the suspension seemed to register weight beside it, though that may be my memory adding more than I truly knew. The steps stopped near the front passenger door. I turned my head very slowly. Nothing. Only fog in the yellow spill of the gate lamps. Then the footsteps began again, moving away from the car, angling toward the front. I leaned forward over the wheel and looked through the windshield. A man emerged from the haze ahead of the car and stopped in the road facing me. The same man. Same height, same jacket, same stillness. But the face was different enough this time that the difference itself became the thing I noticed. He looked older by 10 years, not aged in any dramatic way, just older, more hollow around the cheeks, more tired around the eyes. His hair was thinner at the temples. He stood with the white plastic bag hanging from his hand, and I remember seeing that the bag looked dry. He took a few steps toward the passenger side. Before he reached the door, I looked instinctively into the rearview mirror. There was someone sitting in my back seat. I didn't scream. People always ask that too. There are moments so far outside the mind's categories that the body does not spend energy on dramatic reactions. It becomes quiet. My whole body went so still that for a second I thought I had stopped breathing. In the mirror, I saw, not clearly, but enough, the outline of a man seated directly behind me, slightly turned toward the window. Dark jacket, pale side of face, hands resting in his lap. I spun around in my seat. The back seat was empty. I looked forward again, and the man outside the car was now standing beside the passenger door with one hand lifted, waiting. Waiting is the word I keep returning to. Not demanding, not threatening. Waiting the way a patient person waits for you to finish being confused. My heart had gone from pounding to a heavy, deliberate thud. I could feel each beat separately. The windows began to mist from my breathing. I wiped the inside of the windshield with the side of my hand. The man tapped the glass once with a knuckle. It was a soft sound, so soft that it somehow made everything worse. I put the car into drive and pulled away before I had fully checked the road. Gravel spat from under the tires. The rear end slid and corrected. I did not look back. For a while after that I have no good sense of time. The road continued. That's all I can say. The fog held. The kilometer markers appeared and disappeared. Once I passed a low bridge with no water visible below it, only a white density that might have been fog lying over the channel. Once I thought I heard someone reciting from far off in the fields, then realized it was only wind making shapes out of the fence wires. My phone remained without signal. Twice more I saw movement on the roadside and refused to identify it as anything specific. Then my fuel light came on. It wasn't an emergency. I still had enough to reach the city. But the amber light changed the quality of my fear because it added something measurable to it. Not just unease, not just confusion, a practical limit, a resource going down while I was lost or nearly lost in a place that no longer felt stable. I began speaking aloud to myself, quietly, the way people do when they're trying to remain anchored. Keep driving, stay on the road, watch the line, just reach the junction. My own voice sounded unfamiliar in the car. Eventually the fog thinned just enough that I could see farther ahead than the hood. And there he was again. He was walking in the center of my lane with his back to me. His pace was unhurried. His shoulders were slightly rounded as if from fatigue. The white plastic bag swung lightly from his left hand. I slowed behind him and flashed my headlights once. He did not move aside. I pressed the horn, a short, restrained burst. The sound went out into the fog and returned smaller than it should have. He stepped toward the shoulder at last, and as I drew near, he turned his head. Only his head, not the rest of his body. The face in the side sweep of my headlights looked younger again. Not by much. Enough that I felt the same cold disbelief as before. Younger, cleaner. The beard thinner. The eyes wider set somehow, or maybe only appearing so because the shadows had changed. This was the point at which an ordinary fear gave way to something flatter and worse. Up until then, I had still been oscillating between explanations. After that, the explanations themselves began to feel like part of the fog, something I was producing to keep from seeing what was directly in front of me. I knew I was encountering the same presence over and over. I knew it was presenting itself with slight errors, slight adjustments, as if trying to settle on a version that would convince me. And for the first time, I understood that the differences were not random. They were responses. When I hesitated, it became more ordinary. When I refused, it became more tired, more vulnerable. When I feared it, it became patient. I do not know how I knew that. I just did. The next stretch of road was long and straight, bordered on both sides by low land that held fog like a basin. There were no markers for a while, no structures, no turns. I remember thinking that if I saw him again in that stretch, I would stop, not because I wanted to, but because I needed the shape of the thing to resolve into something I could survive. Endless repetition had become worse than contact. I saw him again less than a minute later. He was standing on the shoulder, facing me this time, one arm wrapped around himself against the cold. No bag, jacket half open, one shoe missing again. I braked and stopped. I don't say that proudly. I say it because it's what happened. A certain kind of pressure had built in me. Not courage, not surrender, something more exhausted than either. I had been alone too long inside that uncertainty. Part of me thought that if I made the situation human, it would become human. A man would get in. I would drive him a few kilometers. He would get out. The road would return to being a road. He came to the passenger side and waited. I unlocked the doors. He opened the door and got in with the careful movements of a tired stranger entering another person's car. No suddenness, no smell of rot, or anything like the stories people like to add when they repeat other people's experiences. He smelled of damp fabric and cold air, and a faint earthy scent like wet ground. He closed the door gently. "Thank you," he said. His voice inside the car was even softer than it had been outside. I pulled back onto the road. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I was acutely aware of his presence beside me, without allowing myself to look directly at him. Water from his clothes, if there was any, made no obvious sound against the seat. The heater pushed lukewarm air toward us both. The windshield fogged faster until I increased the fan. "Where are you going?" I asked. "Toward the bridge," he said. The answer irritated me in a strange, sharp way, perhaps because it repeated the first encounter so closely. "What is there?" "People." It was such a simple answer that I could do nothing with it. I glanced at him then. He looked ordinary, completely, painfully ordinary. Mid-30s, dark hair, stubble, narrow face, a little pale from the cold. His right foot was indeed in a sock darkened with damp at the toes. His hands were clean, except for a line of dirt at one knuckle. He sat with both hands resting on his thighs and looked ahead through the windshield, not at me. "You've been on this road a while?" I asked. "Yes." "Did someone leave you?" He seemed to consider the question. "Something like that?" I gripped the wheel tighter. "I passed you before." "Did you?" "Yes." He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a minor correction. "Maybe." "Maybe?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "It's hard to tell here. I should have ordered him out. I should have stopped and made him leave, no matter the emptiness around us. But fear does not always push you away from what frightens you. Sometimes it makes you cling to the nearest form of company, even while knowing that company is wrong. As long as he remained beside me in one shape, I could pretend the others had been distance and fog and fatigue. Then my headlights reached a figure walking ahead on the shoulder. At first I thought it was a reflector post emerging crooked from the mist. Then the shape separated from the fog and resolved. A man in a dark jacket, carrying a white plastic bag in his left hand, walking away from us along the edge line. I did not understand it immediately. My eyes saw it before my mind admitted what it meant. I felt my foot ease off the accelerator without deciding to do so. The car slowed. The man beside me went completely still. Every part of my body turned cold at once, not chilled, cold, as if something internal had emptied out. "Who is that?" I asked. My voice came out flatter than I expected, almost conversational. That frightens me now more than if I had shouted. The passenger did not answer. The figure ahead continued walking at the same pace, neither turning nor signaling. The plastic bag swung lightly at his side. We drew closer. Headlights laid themselves across the back of his jacket, the damp creases in the fabric, the line of his neck. "Who is that?" I asked again. The man beside me said, very quietly, "Keep driving." I looked at him. His face had changed. Not all at once, not in some theatrical distortion. It was worse than that, because it remained within the range of a human face. But the proportions had shifted in a way I cannot satisfactorily explain. The eyes sat with a fraction too much distance between them. The mouth looked smaller, as if the lips had been drawn with uncertainty. The beard line seemed blurred, like charcoal smudged by a thumb. He was still a man. He was also, unmistakably, an attempt. I slammed the brakes. The car shuddered to a stop. The figure ahead kept walking. The man beside me turned his head toward me with slow care, like someone trying not to startle an injured animal. For a second, I could not move. I could barely hear over the sound of my own pulse. Then I yanked the passenger door handle from my side, but the door did not open because he had his hand on it. Not gripping it hard, resting on it. "Don't stop here," he said. That was the moment. Not seeing him outside and inside. Not the shifting face. Not the repeated road. The moment was the tone of concern in his voice. Genuine concern, or something that had learned its shape well enough to use it. Concern for me, spoken from a thing that had been trying to become a person beside me all night. I tore my hand back from the handle. Something broke loose in me then, some last need to remain polite to the structure of reality. I shoved the car into drive and pressed the accelerator hard enough that the engine protested. The figure ahead vanished into the white wash of headlights as I veered wide around him. I don't know whether I passed to his left or right. I remember only a dark human outline sliding past the edge of the windshield. When I looked back to the passenger seat, it was empty. The door was closed. No one had opened it. I know that because I would have felt the rush of colder air and heard the latch. The seat beside me was empty. I drove. There is no elegant way to describe the rest of that drive. It was not a chase. Nothing ran after me that I saw. The fear after the realization was quieter than before, but more complete. I had stopped looking for explanations. I had also stopped believing that my own senses could be arranged into anything stable. I drove by instinct, by memory of the road's general direction, by the faint promise that if I kept moving, eventually concrete and sodium lights and other people would reappear. Several times I heard a small sound from the back seat. Not movement exactly. The soft settling creak a car makes when weight shifts almost imperceptibly. I did not turn around. I fixed my eyes on the road and kept them there with deliberate force. Once, I saw in the side mirror what looked like a man standing in the field parallel to the car, keeping pace. I did not look again. Once, something knocked gently twice against the trunk from inside or outside. I truly could not tell which. I drove through it all with the same stubbornness people use to cross a room in the dark after hearing a noise they don't want to identify. One step, then another. One marker, then another. After what may have been 20 minutes or may have been 40, the fog began to break. Not fully, just enough that I could see a farther gray ahead. Then a green overhead sign emerged. Then the first orange glow from the outskirts near the industrial district. Then, at last, a truck. A real truck, with dirty lights and a loose mud flap rattling behind it, moving in the same world as me. I cannot describe the relief of that truck. I stayed behind it all the way to the ring road, like a child following an older brother through a crowd. Traffic remained sparse, but the presence of even a few vehicles restored something to the air. The road widened. Concrete barriers appeared. A half-lit gas station stood open near the junction, and I almost pulled in, then kept going because what I wanted by then was my own street, my own front door, my wife's face. I reached home after 1 in the morning. My wife was awake in the living room, annoyed at first because my phone had been unreachable, and I looked, in her words later, like someone who had either been in a fight or had come back from burying someone. I told her there had been dense fog on the provincial road and that I had gotten disoriented. Both things were true. I washed my face. My hands were trembling enough that water splashed onto the floor. She asked if I was sick. I said no. I said I needed a minute. Then I went back to the car. It was parked under the building light where I could see into it clearly. The windows had begun to dry. I opened the passenger door. The seat was damp. Not soaked, just damp in the shape of someone who had sat there in wet clothes for a while. On the rubber floor mat beneath it lay a white plastic shopping bag. I stood looking at it for a long time before touching it. It was the cheap thin kind from any corner shop, twisted once at the handles. There was nothing written on it, no logo, no groceries inside, no papers, nothing at all. It was empty and perfectly dry. I did not take it upstairs. I closed the door, went inside, came back down with gloves, and threw it into the building dumpster across the alley. In the morning, before leaving for work, I checked the dumpster again. The bag was not there. Someone could have taken it. A cleaner. A man collecting recyclable plastic. Wind could have moved it, though the dumpster lid was heavy. None of these explanations feels satisfying, but I know they exist. For several days, I told no one except my wife, and even with her, I told it badly. I kept reducing it to the parts I could make sound sensible. I saw a man on the road several times. The fog was strange. I think I picked up someone who reminded me of him. I was tired and frightened. I left out the worst details at first because saying them aloud made them feel like a choice. My wife listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked only one question. "Did you answer when it used your name?" I said no. She nodded and told me not to take that road again at night for a while. Her reaction bothered me more than disbelief would have, not because she believed me completely, but because she didn't seem surprised that something like this could happen. In our families, there are stories no one advertises, and everyone half carries. An uncle who heard his brother calling from a field after the brother had already gone home. A woman who accepted a ride from a neighbor and found later the neighbor had died the week before. Most of these stories arrive decorated by repetition until they become useless. This one did not feel like a story to me. It felt like an event still in progress, waiting to see if I understood my part in it. I stopped taking the provincial road. For months, I chose the longer highway route, no matter the time, no matter how tired I was. If there was fog, I delayed leaving. If I had to travel at night, I made excuses to bring someone with me. Life, being what it is, gradually placed other things on top of the memory. Work, bills. My aunt recovered. Summer came. Dry heat replaced the wet cold of that night. The fear settled somewhere low in me and stayed there without needing daily attention. Then, about 8 months later, I saw him in the city. Not up close, not in fog thick enough to excuse anything. It was winter again, and a sea mist had come in toward dawn. I was driving to the airport road for a work pickup and stopped at a red light near the edge of the industrial district. There was ordinary traffic around me, a van, 2 taxis, a delivery bike. On the service lane to my right, partly obscured by mist, a man was walking with a white plastic bag in his left hand. He turned his head at the exact moment my car rolled forward. The face was not identical to any of the faces from that night. If I'm honest, if you showed me a photograph of him and asked in daylight whether it was the same man, I might hesitate. But recognition does not always depend on fixed features. Sometimes it lives in the arrangement of attention, in the way something notices you back. He looked at me as if we had paused in the middle of an old conversation. The light changed. Cars behind me moved. I drove. Since then, I have seen versions of him 4 more times, always in fog or rain-heavy mist, or the washed-out uncertainty just before sunrise, when shapes take longer than they should to become themselves. Never in the same place. Never close enough that I had to stop. Once on the shoulder of the ring road near the airport fence. Once standing under an overpass where no pedestrian should have been. Once reflected briefly in the glass of a closed shop while I was walking home and turned to find the street empty. Once, most recently, on a feeder road outside the city, where he stood beside a barrier, with one hand raised in that small, undecided gesture, asking nothing yet. Each time there is some small difference. A bag or no bag. A beard or only stubble. Older, younger. Tired, patient. Once, I think, he was wearing my father's old brown jacket, the one we gave away after he died. I am willing to admit I could be wrong about that. I hope I am. What I know is limited and therefore not useful to anyone who wants certainty. I know that on an empty road at night, repetition can wear down judgment more effectively than fear. I know that whatever I encountered did not need to look impossible. It only needed to look almost right. I know that the most disturbing part was never the thought that something non-human was near me. It was the sense that it was studying how to be received, adjusting itself by fractions, learning which version of a person invites pity, which one earns trust, which one can sit beside you without making you stop the car. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I go back over the details and wonder at what point I let it too near. Was it the first time I answered? The second time I corrected it? The moment I unlocked the door? Or had it begun before that, with something as simple as noticing me alone on a quiet road and understanding that loneliness itself is a kind of opening? I still don't fully know what it wanted. A ride, maybe, in whatever sense such a thing can be meant. Recognition. Permission. Sometimes I think the road itself had something to do with it, the way fog erased distance and made the world small enough for one presence to keep appearing from ahead. Other times I think that's only the environment it preferred, not the cause. A place stripped down to almost nothing, where your need for human certainty becomes strong enough that you start supplying it yourself. There is one detail I have never told my wife. The morning after it happened, before I left for work, I checked the car more carefully than I had the night before. I looked under the seats, inside the trunk, in the door pockets, anywhere I might find some physical explanation strong enough to carry the memory for me. I found nothing except a faint line of dried mud across the back seat floor mat, as if a dirty sock or shoe had rested there briefly. And on the inside of the rear windshield, traced through the condensation that had dried overnight, there were 4 words written with a fingertip. Not in Arabic, not in English, not in any language I recognized. Just 4 separate marks repeated in a neat horizontal line, each shaped almost like writing, and almost like someone practicing the idea of writing without knowing the letters. I cleaned the glass before anyone else saw it. Years have passed now, and I can speak about the night in a steady voice. That makes people think it troubles me less than it does. The truth is that calm is the only way I know to hold it. Panic belongs to the moment itself. What remains afterward is quieter. I still drive at night when I have to. Roads are roads. Work does not adjust itself to private fears. But there are conditions under which I will turn back without debate. Dense fog on an empty rural stretch, no other headlights for too long, a lone figure ahead who seems neither hurried nor lost. And if I ever see the same man twice on the same road again, no matter how small the difference, no matter how ordinary the face, I will not slow enough to hear what he says. What troubles me is that I no longer think that would matter. Because once, about 3 weeks ago, I woke before dawn to the sound of measured footsteps in the corridor outside our apartment. Not stumbling, not searching, just a slow, even pace from one end of the hall to the other, then back again. Old buildings make sounds, I know. Pipes knock. Neighbors leave early. But I lay there listening until I was certain the steps were stopping each time outside our door. My wife slept through it. I got up quietly and looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty. I stayed there long enough for my eye to water. Nothing moved. No one came up the stairs. No elevator sounded. At last, I told myself I was carrying old fear into new rooms. I went back to bed without opening the door. When morning came, I found damp marks on the tile outside. Not footprints exactly, because they were too incomplete for that. Just the partial darkening left by moisture in the shape of someone who had paused more than once in front of our apartment. By noon, they were gone. That same evening, when I went down to the car, there was a white plastic bag caught beneath the windshield wiper. It was empty.